Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of the participants who've already joined on today's webinar from swift-kanban. A very warm welcome to you, and as I'm starting this webinar, I can see other people joining in, so I think we're going to have a great audience today, and I'm personally looking forward to this webinar, our first one for the year, and our first one on Personal Kanban this year. Scaling Kanban in the Enterprise, the Journey is Personal, webinar with Jim Benson. Let me go through some quick introductions and the agenda, and then some housekeeping, and I will introduce you to the speaker. So here's what we're going to do. Start with some introductions, a quick introduction to swift-kanban and Digite, the sponsor of this webinar, and then I'll hand over to Jim, who will take us through what Personal Kanban is all about, and how it relates to scaling Kanban at the enterprise. We'll follow that up with Q&A and do a wrap-up at the end. Just some housekeeping. So we will take questions via the Q&A box that you should be seeing on the bottom right of your screens. And if you go into full screen mode of the webinar, you can still pull up the Q&A box by navigating your mouse to the edge, and where you see the WebEx option that you will have, including the Q&A box. Please use that to enter your questions at any time during the webinar, and we will take them up in the sequence they're received. Also, just so everyone knows, the webinar is being recorded, and the slides and the recording will be made available right after the meeting. So with that, let me talk about Jim. Jim is the CEO of modus operandi, and a very well-known consultant in, as he says, personal, team, and organizational clarity. My name is Mahesh Singh. I'm your host for the webinar today, and I'm co-founder and senior vice president of product at Digite. Jim has very well known to, I think, most of you in the audience today, but for those who don't know him that well, Jim has been building community through policy and technology for government agencies and private enterprise, specializing in distributed team and productivity, and leading highly distributed teams since the early 90s in software development, public policy, professional engineering, and other knowledge work. Today he's the CEO at modus operandi, which uses lean and agile and social media principles to help individuals and small teams. He's the developer of Personal Kanban. This is a great body of work, and has a worldwide following. And I have got to know Jim over the last maybe a year and a half or two, and have hugely enjoyed his talks, his sessions in Lean Coffee, Lean Action Kitchen, and seen him cook, and really enjoyed his interaction. I think those of you who know him know that he's a highly entertaining speaker, and I personally am looking forward to a great talk today by him. And so before I hand over the reins to him, I'm just going to take a couple of more minutes here to talk a little bit about Digite and swift-kanban. So Digite has been a pioneer in web-based collaborative products and solutions for the distributed teams. So we have also a huge background in helping distributed teams collaborate and deliver better value to their customers. We are headquartered in Mountain View, California, and we have offices in India and presence around the world. Over 300,000 users around the world use our products. Our products cover Lean Kanban, Agile ALM, project portfolio management. So we have a fairly rich portfolio of products that might be of interest to you. And of course, swift-kanban is our flagship Lean Kanban product. We have been named by Gartner in a number of documents, including the ALM Market Scope and other related reports. And here is just a quick overview of some of our customers, and we have customers around different industries, different types of organizations, corporate IT, IT services, ISVs, and others, as you see here. And so with that short introduction to Digite and swift-kanban, let me hand over control to Jim, and this will take just a second here. All right, Jim. A warm welcome to you, and you have the controls. And Jim, you're on. Okay.
There I am. All right. So let me make sure that we're actually seeing the right applications, and we are not. So, well, there we go. There's one. And come on. Which one do you suppose it would be? This one? There we go. All right, so good morning, everybody, and go back up there. I'm Jim Benson. I'm the CEO at Modus Cooperandi, as Mahesh said. Thank you, Mahesh, for setting up today. With Tony and Maria Berry, I'm also the author of the book there in the upper right of the screen, Personal Kanban. And if you haven't read it, I'd like it if you read it a couple times. As Mahesh was saying, my background is around producing and releasing things, not necessarily just software, but things as large as subway systems and freeways. And so scaling has been important to me throughout my career because I've worked in teams of 2 or 3 people to make a small report and literally thousands of people to do things like build major infrastructure. And so the systems that we create need to scale as our projects do and as our corporations or our enterprises do. And this has been a problem for us in software because the processes that we've created haven't scaled very well. So we'll talk a little bit today about these things. So the first thing is, like, how do you scale? And what we've tended to do is we've come up with a process and we've scaled that like a balloon. We just keep filling it with more and more and more and more people until the process reaches its own natural carrying capacity, and then it just explodes. And then when it explodes, some interesting things happen. There's first a kind of a tendency to deny that the process has exploded, and to say that you're not doing it right, or that you should do it harder, or that you should bring in some experts to tell you how to do the process better. But actually, the process itself didn't have the carrying capacity necessary to allow you to scale. So what we would like to do is scale more on a molecular model, where you have cohesive, well-working units that interact well with other cohesive, well-working units. And so you set that up in a network-based system where you have a bunch of nodes and then information traveling between the nodes. And in that way, you build a system that isn't reliant upon a central structure, like the outside of the balloon, but it's on autonomous little units that you can take off and put in at will, depending on what the needs of the organization or the needs of the company are. So at the base of this, because that might sound a little bit dehumanizing, but at the base of this is us as people. And we are all individuals, and that just doesn't want to hang up. Now it's over there. Great, the base station rings. So as individuals, we work together to create things, and that's what a company is. A company is a collection of individuals. We've tended to treat the company in the past as a hierarchic device of controlling individuals, and that itself has had its own carrying capacity. And as technologies have changed, as our abilities to communicate have changed, and indeed as our expectations of ourselves and others have changed, we've become less and less tolerant of rigid systems that try and control our work. So what we want to do is create systems that allow us to explore our own individuality, to create relationships with other people in the organization, and those relationships are what become teams, and the teams in turn have relationships out from that. So again, it's that molecular model where each thing is becoming part of a larger thing, and a larger thing is attaching to other larger things to create, bigger and bigger systems. So we want to build this system from the ground up. And one of the reasons we want to build the system from the ground up is because you want to have a good foundation. And the biggest problem that we have is that management or people who are running an organization, they have things that they want. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they can't get those things if there's just mass confusion in the base of the company, and that's the individual. And fundamentally, as individuals, we don't understand the amount of work in progress we have at any given time. We're not quite sure who we're doing the work for. We are siloed and have institutional barriers from talking to other people who are our peers in production. And fundamentally, we don't know at any given point in time what our options are as far as what are we doing, what could we do differently as far as tasks, as far as process, as far as products. You know, we don't know where our range is of how to change those things for the better, of how to seek improvement. So, as I was saying a second ago, management itself, they want something that everybody else wants. They want to make a healthy company. And the healthy company needs to have a plan. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to have a rigid plan that it sticks to, but the management of the company needs to have an idea of where the company's going, how it's going to get there, and what it's actually capable of doing. The company needs to make money to continue to pay the people in the company, and it needs to coordinate. So management itself needs to say, okay, we want to build this new thing. We're going to take resources from this part of the company and this part of the company and this part of the company. We're going to mix them together to create this new thing. And in order to do that, again, if we go back up to here, they can't do this if people are routinely overworked, you know, if they don't understand who it is they're serving and they don't understand how to actually build things, right? So no one knows these things, and we're just living basically in a big ball of confusion. So when we look at our previous attempts to scale Agile, which is very much a team-focused, team-centric system, it's not focused on the individual and it's not focused on the organization. And this is why we've had a hard time scaling these particular activities. So just consider a few things here. The first is that you are your organization. The individual is the organizational. So without these individuals, companies do not exist. The word company means company. You actually are doing this work in the company of your peers. You know, while there is a legal organization that's called a company and it can exist of one person, you can't do business by yourself either. You know, you need suppliers, you need people to sell things to. You become part of something bigger than yourself when you're part of a company, but you are still you. So as I mentioned before, hierarchies or dictatorships, they focus very well, right? So if you have a dictatorship, you can produce something really well for a short period of time. But what you generally don't do in a dictatorship is innovate. It's because people aren't compelled to innovate because they're focused on the thing you've told them to focus on. And if they focus on anything else, they're afraid they're going to get fired. So we want individuals to have agency, to make decisions, to look beyond themselves in their companies, to see problems and be able to fix them. And they can only have that agency if they have an understanding of their own work and an awareness of what's happening in the rest of the company. And without those things, companies will, as it says here, stagnate and die. So this last slide here, and then we'll actually get in and work with the Kanban for a little bit, is that what our goal is in Kanban and Personal Kanban is to start to become aware. And so to become aware of the role of variation in our work, to make our work tangible and visible, not only to ourselves, but to the people that we're working with. So we want to, right now, knowledge work is very invisible. I can keep giving you work and you just keep saying yes because you're not aware of how much work that is actually entails and what actually happens when you start to work on things. How often are you interrupted? How often do you have to have meetings? So in a given 8-hour day, how much quote-unquote work are you actually able to do? No one can really answer that question. We want to confront, we can't necessarily explain away or dispel, but we at least want to confront the fact that when we're working, we make assumptions, and those assumptions are based on various cognitive biases that we have that may be leading us to do things that are harmful to ourselves and our company. We want to be able to validate or invalidate our assumptions, and we want to have systems in place that check our cognitive biases and help us mitigate their nefarious impacts. Then we want to lower those high levels of work in progress that almost every knowledge worker is dealing with. And by doing all of these things, we start to confront the unreasonable expectations of ourselves and of the company. So we have unrealistic expectations of ourselves, our teams have unrealistic expectations of us and our teams, and the company has unrealistic expectations across the board. So we need to understand what is the true flow of work, why are people actually working at that rate, and what improvements can we make to increase the flow of work and the flow of quality at the same time. That's what we want to do with Personal Kanban and Kanban, and so let's go take a peek at what that looks like. If I can remember how to do that. Make sure that you're looking at this. And I think you are. All right. So, so this is a little Kanban that I drew up in swift-kanban, and it's kind of a complex personal Kanban. And at my first company, Gray Hill Solutions, this is kind of the board that we used as a shared personal Kanban for a large group of people. So it was still very personal work-based, and indeed we had specific swim lanes for each person in the company. But the most important thing that we added here is this validate column, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But first, for the people here who aren't completely familiar with Kanban or personal Kanban, I'll quickly go over the elements of what's in a board. So first, personal Kanban only has 2 rules. One is to visualize your work, which you're doing here, and you're doing that because you can better manage what you can see. So if you can't see it, it's hard to keep track of it, it's hard to know the weight of things, so on and so forth. The second rule is that you want to limit your work in progress. And we do that because you can't do more work than you can handle. And it's pretty much just that simple. Now, what happens internally is very complex and leads me to run all over the world talking about all sorts of different aspects of this. This very simple system ends up having some pretty profound results in how people work. Right now, I want to discuss the ins and outs of this board here. So here in this board, you see that we're visualizing our work through what's called a value stream. The value stream are your steps to create value. So we have the ready column, which is stuff we haven't done yet. The current work column, which is stuff that we're doing. The validation step, which is somebody on our team takes a look at what we've done and just makes sure that it's cool, and then it goes out. So again, at my software company at Gray Hill, I had a business partner named William, and William and I had a rule that anything that left the company that was customer facing had to be checked by somebody else, even if it was by me or William. So even as we switched off as being CTO and CEO each year. And so each time we had to send something important out, the other person would actually validate it. And we had a whole bunch of reasons for that, but it's a good idea to have a second pair of eyes look at your work. So in this case, I would finish this task, and then the next morning, I would ask, I would say, we look and we notice that I finished these 2 things, and then maybe William would look over this, and Alan would look over this, and then by the next day, they had moved into approved. Validation steps tend to be very quick, but you wouldn't believe the amount of time that even, when you think it's a simple task, how many times things come back. And when they come back quickly, you can fix them quickly, and then you see them in the future. You learn more from them. But like, let's say that this is an email, or this is a blog post, right? So I write this blog post, and then Alan checks it over, and Alan says, you really should mention this. And I say, okay, and then I mention this, and then I try again. Let's say I actually release the blog post, and then the blog post goes out, and then 2 or 3 weeks later I'm at a conference and somebody says, you really should have mentioned this. Then A, I missed the value of putting it out, but B, I also missed the opportunity to learn from that and to watch for those things in the future. So the functions of the board really quickly, you see here that we have a width limit of 3. It's all filled up now. Toss in another one. The system gets angry and lets you know you have exceeded your work in progress limit. From a personal perspective, we want to focus on work in progress limits because something called the Zeigarnik effect. And the Zeigarnik effect says, when I complete something, when I've moved it over here, then I get closure and I move on. But when I don't finish something and I start something else, I keep thinking about it. So if I have a situation like this, where I have all of these things in progress at once, I'm thinking about all these things all the time. And that's taking away from my capacity to actually focus on my work and do it of quality. So when we keep this cold to a more reasonable level, then we start to get a flow of work. So things get finished at a certain pace, and as they get finished, I kind of learn about how my work naturally flows through my system. I will start to notice that yellow tickets flow at a certain rate, gray tickets flow at a certain rate, and so on and so forth. And this is important organizationally because it starts to tell me how I actually can get overloaded. So before, all tasks were created equal, and when they came to me, I would take them all on readily. And if I was having conversations or people were available, I would, stop them and talk about it. So let's say, in a pre-WIP limited world, I had something that looked like this, and I'm working away, and then all of a sudden I see John in the hallway, and I'm like, hey, John, let me talk to you about your memo. That's just kind of something that we as human beings do naturally. And what I've actually done is I've now actually added something that I'm actively doing into my head that I have to think about without finishing something else first. And it's not like I couldn't find John later on to ask that same question, but I was thinking about this in terms of resource efficiency as opposed to my own productive optimization. And so one of the things that with the organization that we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, okay, you know what? I have a certain way of working. My team has a certain way of working. And those are fairly individual, right? There's quirks of the product that my team is putting out that's going to make it have a subtly different value stream or a different flow of work than other people have. And when we start to explore that, then we start to find ways to actually optimize the existing teams. So I'll pop out of this really quickly, and I will show you some pictures. So a couple of days ago, I will show you some pictures if it chooses to. All right, we'll go back to the small ones. World, there you go. Sorry, these are small. I went to a client, to visit a client a couple weeks ago, and we did something that we call a boardwalk. And a boardwalk is where we from Modus will come in and we will walk the boards of the teams in the group, and we'll talk about how work is flowing, how their value stream is working, how their upstream and downstream partners are communicating with them, what their work item types are, basically all of the elements of a Kanban we'll be discussing with them. And asking questions, making some recommendations, and so forth. What was interesting about this trip is, so here's this board. This board is entirely set up as, this is basically Stacy and James's personal work, and then occasionally down here we've got Expedite at the bottom for emergencies that come in. Then we have, let's see, this team here, where this team is group-based. So they're based entirely on grooming, development, testing, UAT, work's flowing through there. Work from this first one is flowing through summer user stories, and some are, but mostly it's task level. But when we come up to this one here, this is all in the user story level. We see here another team. This team has kind of a personal Kanban approach, but they're headed up for a big release day. So they've actually put in a calendar inside their to-do section so that they can make sure that they get the things done that they need to by their deadlines. So this is actually a deadline-driven Kanban, which people seem to think can't actually happen. Go up to another intro. As you can see, as I'm going through these, all of these are different. This one they do active stories, and then they run through the actual tasks of the active stories. This one is, again, this is all personal based, and there's one here where these guys pair. And come up to this one. This is one for their system architects. I'm sorry that it's small. I wish the full screen thing was working right. But inside their doing column, they have this ingenious little device that says basically this axis is how long something is until it's completed, so from 4 months to right now. And then over here, this is how much attention they're paying to it, like almost nothing to lots. And the issue here is that the architects themselves are actually invested and active in every project that's going on. There's only 4 of them, and there's a lot of projects. So they needed to keep track of the things they were doing for those projects, but they also recognized that a lot of that work wasn't actually very time-consuming. So doing the WIP limiting via 3 things at once didn't work very well. So what they did instead was over here, where this is where lots of attention is being paid. When you get over here, you'll see there are very few tickets. So they basically limit their WIP by site and say, okay, we shouldn't have more than 2 tickets per person over here. And over here, it's anything goes. And so what we're seeing as we go through here, I mean, here's a team that has a bunch of small tasks, small projects, but they're also really into kickboxing movies. So they have all these pictures over here of Jean-Claude Van Damme and Jean-Claude Van Damme quotes around here. If you would have looked closely at some of the other boards, you would have seen that like one was the Vanilla Ice board, another one was the Kanban Jovi board. But the teams are expressing their own personalities and their own ways of working through the board themselves. And each of these boards, when we went in, the people were all saying, our boards are all insane. We need to have standardized boards. But what they've actually done is they've optimized their boards. So each of these boards are optimized to how this team produces value. They're not standardized to how the company thinks they should provide value. And that's a personal choice as opposed to an organizational choice. So here, even though this Kanban itself is only running user stories, this is a very personalized, personal Kanban because it's acknowledging that the people in the team are actually on the team and they have a personality and they have impact on the work that's being done. The other interesting thing about how this particular large group of people were working, in the aggregate, so you see that they're all in 15 separate teams, but they are all a group, is they're all on one floor. All of their boards are physical, so they're all constantly visible. And as you can see, like this board here is on a wall. It's written directly on the wall. So rather than doing it with whiteboard paint, They did just the lacquer top of the whiteboard paint over existing paint so that the place doesn't look all bright and glowy. And you can see that many of these boards are just written directly on the walls. And that means that when people are walking around from place to place, they're seeing everybody else's boards, they're asking questions, and they're doing a lot of real-time learning just based on that close proximity and that close communication. The other thing that came out in this event was that they said, okay, and a year ago, I'll step back really quickly. A year ago when we started with this team, or these teams, they were right where my original slides were. They didn't understand the work that they had in progress. They didn't understand how they related to people outside their work. They basically just got a task and worked on it because the system was so confusing that they couldn't spend their time trying to think of the system. Since using their Kanbans for 14 months, now when I showed up, they started to say things like, can I use my board to see where the business analysts are getting the work that they're giving us? And can I use my board to see what happens after release? So what's interesting is that from an awareness standpoint, initially all they could handle was to be aware of the overload of tasks that they had. But as we limited WIP and started to visualize even just their team's value stream, their awareness of their work started to spread out. So it's no longer I am a siloed worker, it's now I'm actually part of a team that provides value. And then after you get to there, then the natural curiosity then is to go outward into the rest of the organization. So we're starting with the personal. Please call my individual work so I can get things done, because as a professional, that's important to me. And then later on, it's please help me and my team get things done, because as a team, we want to do good things for the organization. And then we move out from there. And after a while, people can actually feel like they're part of their companies as opposed to a part that's being used by their companies. So when we're talking about scaling, what I like about this system is that we're noting that everybody that's involved at any tier in the organization has information needs. They have an impulse or a drive to help improve and repair things. And like on this board, I'm going to try and make it big again and then hope that it works. There it goes. Awesome. I'm not sure if you can see it as well as I can, but in this center part here, they basically came in one day and in a stand-up realized that they didn't like the way that they'd drawn their value stream. So like this is in green, this is in green, this is in green, and then there's like this really messy scratching out, and then they rewrote their value stream and went back to work. This board itself is so easy to change and so impermanent that they just didn't care how it looked. They wanted it to do the work. And we can compare that to find this board here. So this board here is by a team that, you know, very highly performing team. They're getting their work done and everything. But the first thing that I noticed when we were doing the boardwalk is I said, there's nothing in these two columns. And they said, yeah, and these two columns are ready for testing and testing in progress. And I said, are your testers really fast, or do they skip things? And they said, no. In the first couple of weeks of the project, we decided that we actually wanted to bring the testers into the development teams and have them pair. So we don't actually do testing like that anymore. And so I said, well, why is it still on your board? And they said, because the tape's up. So even just putting these pieces of tape on a window was enough to make this process more permanent organizationally than it actually was useful for the team. So when we have a situation like this, where these guys have just, you know, scratched this stuff out, I find this preferable. I find that quite preferable. So if we go back over here to this board, when we want to, at any given point in time, we just reach up here and modify this process, right? We can go in, we can add new lanes, we can add new things. And that impermanence is a very important part for me of the personal side of personal Kanban. And it's also very important to me for the team and the organizational levels, because the more permanent that we make our processes, the more we go for standardization over optimization, the less likely we are to improve in the future. So when you have a process that has a bunch of rituals and a bunch of things that you have to do on a regular basis, it becomes hard to know what part of the process you can actually change and which you can't without getting into trouble. You can't scale a process that you don't feel like you have personal control over. So I think that that's about as far as I want to go here. We've got, you know, about 20 minutes or so left. So I'm trying to figure out how this thing works so that I can go back and see what the questions are. Are there any questions?
Sure, Jim. You can actually just go back to the big return. You can click on the return button that you see, and it will take you back into the meeting room. And
okay.
You can transfer control to me, or I can get back control.
Okay. I see. Pause, share, assign, mute.
So you can just say stop sharing.
Ah, there we go.
All right, and if I can have control back here. Excellent. And let me just go ahead and share my.
Fair questions.
Right, and there are some questions here. But I wanted to start off with one of my own, Jim. And first of all, did you actually say a Kanban Jovi board?
Yes, yes. There's also a picture of a giant screaming Kirkhead on another one that's called the Kanban board. Yeah, and it gets worse. So, while it's silly and an inside joke for them, it just seems pathetic to other people. So I probably shouldn't go into too much detail.
Okay, but I love the concept because I think essentially what you said was that teams are able to express themselves using their boards and their personality, and it motivates them to do things the right way and focus on the right work. And in that process, they are essentially doing what the organization wants them to do anyway. And I thought that was a great way to let teams evolve their process and evolve themselves overall, rather than a typical centralized approach where processes might be being thrust on teams.
Right.
Awesome. So one question that I wanted to ask, which we hear a lot at our end when we're doing demos of swift-kanban, etc., and we talk about personal Kanban, is that do you normally see organizations run a sort of parallel initiatives, of enterprise and team level Kanbans different from a personal Kanban initiative? So are people sort of working at two levels, managing their own Kanban boards and also participating in their team Kanban boards?
Well, what Tony Ann and I have seen that has always surprised us in a good way is when we'll come in and we'll do an event, we end up in a situation where we are not only talking about where we're teaching Kanban and we're working with the teams on the Kanban, but we're also running through a couple of lean coffees over the course of the week. And what ends up happening is people start to integrate the idea of visualization, and that visualization is probably more important than the idea of the Kanban necessarily. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Yep.
So it becomes natural for people to start to do their own tactical personal Kanbans while they're sitting at their desk with little sticky notes that just basically tell them, today I need to do a bunch of these tasks. Whereas in Swift Kanban, there might be all of the team's work for in user story format. And then at a vice president level, there might be another Kanban that is up there doing more of a strategic workflow management or road mapping exercise using the Kanban. And so what I've enjoyed is that very seldom do people call me up and say, what should my value stream be for this type of a Kanban? Because once people get that it's supposed to reflect their reality, they haven't had much trouble adapting it to their reality. Now it's getting that hump of accepting that you have control that's been the big issue.
Right. Okay, great. And I think we have a few questions that are along similar themes. So let's take one question here. It says, so is Kanban focusing on each person's tasks against focusing on users in Scrum? And a related question is there a way to focus on personal tasks without losing focus on user stories? So there is the sort of scope or work decomposition from your overall product to epics to user stories, and those are on a Kanban board typically, or a Scrum board, and then you have your personal tasks being done against that. Typically, are these going up on the same board, or again, is there a sort of a hierarchy of boards that handles that? Right.
And so I've seen this handled in a lot of ways. So one of the boards that I showed in that little slideshow, one of those boards had a variety of user stories that were currently active, and then they had tasks that were emanating out from those user stories. And that was a team of, I think, 6 people. And so each person had 3 tasks that they could be working on at a time, and the team itself could only be working on, I think it was 6 user stories as a whole. And so they wanted, as a group, to be working at the task level because they were that tight, and they were watching what each other was doing, and they were doing some pairing, but they were doing a lot of advising, and they were building something that was complex enough, even though they were a small team, that they wanted constant situational awareness. There was one of the teams that Tony and I worked with at the Library Corporation. They would launch. They had an epic in progress limit, so they would launch one epic. That epic would give birth to a bunch of user stories, and then they would track the tasks in those user stories, and then when they were all done, they would fold that up kind of into a book, and they would know the major piece of a client deliverable value, all of the user stories that led into that, and then the tasks that they undertook to do those things. And in looking back at that granularity of information, they were able to get a much better idea of where they were spending productive time and where they were wasting their time. The good news and the bad news is that this thing has only 2 rules. So that's a good news because it means that you have a lot of flexibility, but it's kind of a bad news because it means that you really do need to watch and think about these things. And I'm fond of overstating this by saying that your Kanban is always lying to you.
Right.
So your value stream is a model, and the work items within that value stream are parts of that model. And human models are all they're not infallible. So that's why we have continuous improvement, because there's always something in that board that you can change or mess around with.
Absolutely, and Kanban boards design keeps changing all the time. Let's take up another question here that says, so you explained that variations in each team's board are optimizations. So how do you recommend that teams learn from each other so that they can further optimize based on each other's experiences?
Oh, that's a fun question. The team with 15 boards, or the company with 15 boards, what I appreciated about how they were approaching learning was that they weren't doing it by assuming that they learned in any one way. So they have a very enthusiastic group, and this is kind of rare for a company of their size. They're obviously large enough to have 15 teams. They're a financial services firm, so this is the application development group in a financial services firm. But these people are so into what they're doing, and they're so into the notion that they have, this agency and this control, which of course they didn't before. They've taken on teaching themselves in all sorts of really interesting ways. So there's one guy in the group who is really interested in video-based webinars. And so he's constantly trolling the net for things. And then when he finds a bunch of them, he will get them in a group and he'll say, okay, this week I'm going to do 5 brown bags and we're just going to watch these and talk about them. The company themselves, they do a weekly lean coffee in-house. So whoever wants to show up and talk about whatever, they get together and talk, and that brings in people from upper management and line staff and customers and the whole bit. And by customers, I mean internal customers in the company. They get a lot of benefit out of that. And they've also been willing to invest in bringing in outside voices. So this particular company will, if people get into, there's a reading group, and the reading group reads a book by a certain author, they'll go out and investigate how much it would cost to bring in that author for a day or two to just hang out and talk. And the most important element there is a desire on the part of the coders themselves to want to continuously learn. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the cool thing about it is that since they've got about 200 people on that floor, you can be really into continuously learning for a couple of weeks, and then you can kind of fall off the wagon, and then you can come back because somebody's there to pick up the slack. Right. It's a lot harder in a small group to keep that up because you're never allowed to want to take a break. So that's one of the other things that I think is interesting about this molecular model that I'm talking about is that even in their learning in this company, they've created a distributed model for that. There is no person on the floor that's in charge of coordinating all learning activities or anything like that. It's just actually part of the culture.
Right, right. And I have personally enjoyed a number of lean coffee sessions where the format and the presence of coffee and perhaps some donuts always helps some great discussion to go to sort of happen and people to really take interest in the learning. Great. So, and I think we probably answered a couple of related questions here. There's a similar question on how do you suggest coordination, and well, this is different actually. So, how do you suggest coordination and tracking dependencies between multiple Kanban groups? And I presume that means multiple Kanban boards.
Right.
Right, and teams.
Okay, so that is not an easy question. And a lot of it is, unfortunately, highly situational. So there are questions there about, the interdependencies of what is being developed can take many different forms. So you can have products that are quite comfortable being subjected to a regular integration schedule. So like an iterative integration schedule. And then you have other products that, or teams or organizations that don't work very well in that model. So, I mean, ideally you have different teams working on the same code base, doing frequent check-ins with a good regimen of both unit testing and some coding standards that are allowing the software to be written in a coherent manner that help you avoid the problems that we find at integration points. If you have teams that are actively working on things that could mess up other teams, and you treat those teams as siloed, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So at least, then this is a generic case that I'm talking about here. So this is one of the problems is that I'm making statements now that people will take as advice without fully understanding the context of of the actual team. But generically, if you have multiple teams that are working together to create something that is that complex, their boards should not be hidden from each other.
Right.
And if you may actually have one giant team, and because somebody has told you that a team can't be more than 8 people, you've chopped it up into dysfunctional little units. So I'm going to make the scary statement right now that sometimes you actually might have a team of 50 people. And if that's the case, you need to confront it, and you need to visualize that on a board as opposed to chopping it up into tiny pieces and distributing it around a bunch of teams that may seem like they make functional sense, but what you've actually done is you've siloed value in an inappropriate way. Is that an answer?
I think so. I think it talks about, and I think Kirk here, that's where the question came from. He clarifies at the bottom of the questions. You'll see that he's talking about multiple functional groups like web billing, SOA, etc. And a typical issue is the web guys waiting on the infrastructure to create a new server, for example, and that's a very typical example of dependency that you might have. So just to also add to what Jim said. You will have tools that provide you some help here. So in the case of swift-kanban, we have the ability for you to define links between links has got a hierarchy of cards which can span multiple boards. So you might have for example, a customer ticket come in, and that has work to be done by the dev team and the infra team. You can actually create a hierarchy and then have those lower level tickets working on the individual teams' boards, and the link shows that that there is a dependency there. And so you will see electronic tools perhaps solving some of that problem, but ultimately, as you said, Jim, I think it does make sense that all the boards are visible to all the teams, so they know that what is the context in which they're working.
Mm-hmm. I mean that's one of the hardest things about being on my side of a consulting engagement is that I can never come into a group assuming that I know any answers at all. I need to come into a group and listen very carefully about what exactly is happening, and then apply various techniques to either visualize or manage that work. But there is no one right way to build software.
Right. So let me take up another question. One of my favorite topics comes from Elena. A quick question about the board. How would you limit the number of items in a given column? So how do you do WIP limits? And what are the keys to do a deadline-driven Kanban? Well,
the deadline-driven Kanban was we've only seen it twice, where someone has set up a calendar within the Kanban to do strict deadline driven. Two questions there. So there are a lot of ideas out there about how to set up WIP limits. My way of setting up a WIP limit is entirely arbitrary. Basically, what feels good initially, and then work with it, and then see if it breaks. And then if it does, raise or lower your WIP limits, to suit. So if you run into a downstream bottleneck, one of two things is happening. There has been a breakdown in that part of the system, or the system before it is feeding in more work than that part of the system can ingest. And you would need to run a series of experiments to see, or ask some questions to see which that is, and then make some adjustments accordingly. So if you have a dev team that has a WIP limit of 4, and you have a test team that is completely buried by work, you would want to, we want to change the WIP limits to suit. The second question was, what was the second question?
What are the keys to do deadline-driven Kanban?
That's right. So I wouldn't say that there are keys to them. There are, this is all experiments by people who are doing this stuff. Excuse me, my cold's starting to catch up on my throat here, I think. But the way that we've seen this work, or the ways that we've seen this work, are 3. One is actually build a calendar into your Kanban and start to place tasks in places where either you would need to start working on them in order to finish them by the deadline, or in ways that you can alert yourself that those deadlines are coming up. The second way that we've seen is many of the Kanban tools will actually let you set, the digital tools will let you set a deadline in a particular task or for a particular card, and then the closer you get to that deadline, the more the card kind of glows at you. The interesting thing here is that the true answer to this directly relates to what your cycle time is. So if you have a cycle time of 4 days, and you have a task that's coming up that needs to be completed in 4 days, then you would need to start it now. And if it was coming up in 8 days, you might be able to wait. From a personal level, that's the manager response. But from a personal level, so everything that is in every ticket that you have in your Kanban is an option. And you exercise that option when that option value reaches a point where exercising it makes sense. So if you exercise it too soon, then you did work before you needed to, and you could have done something of higher value. If you do it too late, then you won't realize the value of the thing. So if something has a deadline of Tuesday and you do it on Wednesday, you've screwed up. So we personally get stressed out if we do things and they're completed at the very last second, because we know that there's 0 time for review if we do it that way. So your strike time is not going to be, for a given task, isn't going to be your cycle time minus the deadline, or your deadline minus cycle time. So if your cycle time is 4 days, it's probably going to be more than 4 days before that, so that you can do it in a way that's a little more relaxed, more organized, and you can focus and feel like if something happens, you're not going to be late. And that's delicate. That's a delicate maneuver, because it's not quantifiable. It's very personal, and it's very annoying. So it's annoying to you. It's annoying to other people on your team, right? Because you are constantly thinking, I should be doing these other things, or they're thinking you should be doing something else. So that is definitely a juggling act. the last little bit I'll say about deadlines, because we have reached 10 o'clock, is that the first question to ask when you get a deadline is, really? Because most deadlines are actually arbitrarily set. And if we can understand what the need is for the value and how that relates to the option value, that's more important than actually understanding the arbitrary deadline that someone's given you because of something else. Now, there are real deadlines, so if you are a fill-in Santa Claus, you can't show up for work on the 26th of December. So I hear Mahesh playing your speech is going on too long music. So so thank you, everybody, and I will sit back and turn over control to Mahesh again.
Okay, I'm sorry, actually I didn't mean to do that, because we do have some great questions here, and I would like to take up some more, but we are at the end, and I can see people slowly starting to find the way out of the webinar.
Right.
So I just wanted to say that to the questions that were not answered, that we will try and respond to them over email, and hopefully over another webinar that we are able to do sometime real soon. So with that, Jim, thanks so much for a great webinar, a great talk, and I could see the Twitter traffic going up and down, and I wanted to say that is probably one of the best demos of swift-kanban that I've seen. I think I need to talk to people in Digitech and see if you might be able to come train our sales team. I think we can learn a few things there. but awesome talk, and I hope that everyone felt the same, and I'm sure they did. So just reminder to people that we will be sending out an email latest by tomorrow with a link to download the slides and a link to the recording. And in the meantime, if you want to get in touch with Jim, you have his details here. Of course, if you just search for Jim Benson on Google, you'll have all his information. And if you're interested in swift-kanban and what the tool can do, and I saw a few questions that related to what a tool like swift-kanban can do for you to help you manage Kanban, you can write to us at sales@digitech.com. And we'll be happy to answer those questions for you. So thanks a lot, Jim. Thanks very much, and I hope your cold gets better soon.
Thank you.
And with that, we come to the end of the webinar. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.